They crossed entire continents without food wagons. No supply chains followed behind them. No long caravans carried grain. Yet cities kept falling before them. Empires kept collapsing in weeks. Armies starved trying to chase them. How does an army invade thousands of miles without carrying its own food? Modern militaries depend on logistics. Supply lines decide victory or defeat. Cut the supplies, the army dies. But the Mongols broke that rule completely. They did not protect supply routes. They did not fear being surrounded. They did not slow down for food. So what were they eating? How were they surviving deserts and winters? And why could no empire stop them? Because the Mongol army was not fighting like other armies. It was built to live off something far more dangerous. And once you understand that system, you understand why they conquered the world. If you want history without the sugarcoating, if you want to understand how power really works, then subscribe to Forgotten Empires, because the biggest battles in history were never fought on battlefields. For most of history, wars were not decided by courage, they were decided by food. An army could be brave, disciplined, and heavily armed, but if its supply lines were cut, it would collapse without a battle. Grain mattered more than swords. Water mattered more than strategy. Behind every medieval army stretched a fragile lifeline. Long baggage trains rolled slowly across rough land. Oxen pulled heavy wooden wagons filled with grain sacks. Blacksmiths repaired armor on the move. Camp followers cooked, cleaned, and maintained the marching force. The further the army traveled from home, the thinner and more vulnerable that lifeline became. This was the universal rule of war. Generals protected supply routes more carefully than they protected flanks. Roads were secured. Storage depots were fortified. Entire campaigns failed simply because food could not arrive on time. If you cut the supplies, you killed the army. Now imagine an army that ignored this rule completely. No endless wagon trains behind them, no secure roads feeding their advance, no massive grain depots waiting ahead, and yet, they crossed continents. They invaded Central Asia, Persia, China, and Eastern Europe in a single lifetime. They moved across deserts where farming was impossible. They rode through frozen plains where crops could not grow, and they did not slow down. This was the Mongol army. Their invasions did not crawl forward cautiously. They surged like sudden storms. Cities that believed themselves safe were surrounded within days. Kingdoms that expected long sieges faced lightning assaults instead. Enemies tried familiar tactics against them. They burned fields before retreating. They evacuated food stores. They destroyed bridges and blocked trade routes. It worked against other invaders. It did not work against the Mongols, because the Mongols were not operating within the traditional system of war. They were not stretching supply lines behind them. They were not depending on distant harvests. They were not tied to vulnerable roads. Their entire structure was different. Most empires built armies from cities. Farmers became soldiers. Soldiers marched away from their economic base. The further they moved, the weaker their connection to survival became. The Mongols came from the steppe. The Eurasian steppe was not farmland. It was a vast ocean of grass stretching beyond the horizon. Winters were brutal. Summers were dry. Stability was rare. Survival demanded movement. From childhood, Mongols learned to live in motion. They did not grow up anchored to villages. They grew up riding. A Mongol child could ride before he could properly walk. Hunting was not sport. It was training. Endurance was not optional. It was normal life. Food was not guaranteed. It had to be secured through adaptability. Dependence was dangerous on the steppe. If you relied too heavily on one resource, a harsh season could destroy you. If you settled too comfortably, you became vulnerable. Mobility was protection. Flexibility was strength. That mentality did not disappear when they went to war. It became their greatest weapon. Each Mongol warrior did not ride a single horse into battle. He traveled with several. When one horse tired, he switched instantly. This allowed them to move extraordinary distances without exhaustion. Armies that thought they had outrun the Mongols often discovered the opposite. But speed alone does not feed an army. Horses require sustenance. Warriors require energy. Campaigns require planning. And yet, the Mongols marched farther and longer than armies with organized supply systems. This was not chaos. It was design. The Mongol military system was built from nomadic life itself. Their economy was mobile. Their resources were not fixed in cities. Their survival mechanisms traveled naturally with them. Other empires separated civilian life from military campaigns. The Mongols did not. What sustained their society in peace sustained their army in war. This erased the greatest vulnerability most armies carried into battle. European knights feared being cut off from supply routes. Persian forces guarded trade corridors carefully. Chinese armies relied on organized granaries and transport networks. The Mongols carried their lifeline differently. It did not stretch behind them like a fragile thread, it rode beside them. Because of this, traditional defensive strategies failed. Blocking roads did nothing. Destroying farmland achieved little. Ambushing supply wagons became meaningless. Their enemies kept fighting the wrong target. They attacked what they believed was the weakness of every army: logistics. But the Mongols had redesigned logistics entirely, and until their enemies understood how that system worked, they had no way to stop it. The Mongols did not eliminate logistics, they replaced it. While other empires dragged food behind them, the Mongols carried survival in a completely different form. Their supply system was not made of wagons and grain sacks, it was made of animals. Every Mongol warrior rode with multiple horses, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, sometimes more. These were not just spare mounts for speed, they were living reserves of mobility, transport, and sustenance. A Mongol army was not a column of soldiers, it was a moving ecosystem. The steppe nomads did not separate warfare from pastoral life. Their wealth was livestock, their currency was herds. Their survival depended on animals long before conquest began. When they went to war, they did not abandon that system, they weaponized it. Maras traveled with the army. From them, warriors drank fermented Maras milk, arag, a calorie-dense, portable source of nutrition. It did not require cooking, it did not require grain, it moved naturally with the cavalry. If necessary, a Mongol rider could open a vein in his horse, drink small amounts of blood, then seal the wound without killing the animal. It was not a daily practice, it was an emergency measure, but it symbolized something important. They were never truly cut off from sustenance. Their horses grazed while the army rested. The vast grasslands of Eurasia became their feeding ground. They did not need harvested fields waiting ahead. They needed pasture, and pasture was everywhere across the steppe and beyond. Other armies depended on fixed agriculture. The Mongols depended on movement. This difference changed everything. European knights required bread and salted meat carried in wagons. Persian armies organized supply depots along roads. Chinese forces developed elaborate grain transport networks using rivers and canals. All of it was slow. All of it was vulnerable. The Mongols removed the slowest part of war, dependency on stored food. Their diet was simple but efficient. Dried meat could be carried compactly. Fermented milk products lasted long journeys. Herd animals could be slaughtered when necessary. Nothing required permanent infrastructure. Nothing required waiting. This allowed them to move with terrifying unpredictability. When a traditional army advanced, observers could track its supply line, destroy the wagons, and the army would retreat, block the roads, and the army would hesitate. But how do you block an army that feeds from the land itself? How do you starve a force that carries its livestock with it? Burning crops ahead of invasion did little against them, destroying granaries did not weaken them. Ambushing caravans meant nothing because there were no caravans. Their food supply could not be separated from their movement. And because of this, their campaigns did not follow normal patterns. They could divide into multiple columns without fear. Smaller units could travel independently for weeks. They did not need daily shipments from a central source. They did not fear isolation in the same way other armies did. Mobility became independence. Independence became strategic dominance. But this system worked for another reason: discipline. The Mongol army was organized in strict decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. This structure was not just administrative, it allowed coordinated movement across massive distances. Each unit could operate semi-independently while remaining part of a larger strategy. Their logistical models supported this flexibility. Because each warrior carried part of the survival system, the army did not collapse if separated temporarily. They could regroup quickly without starving in the meantime. This was revolutionary. Other empires centralized their strength. The Mongols decentralized it, and decentralization made them harder to predict, harder to trap, and harder to exhaust. But there was another layer to this system, one even more powerful than livestock. Conquest itself became supply. As they invaded settled regions, they absorbed resources efficiently. They did not waste time rebuilding infrastructure immediately. They extracted what was necessary and moved on. Skilled captives were integrated. Resources were redirected. War funded war. Speed protected them from long-term shortages. The faster they moved, the less resistance could organize against them. The shorter the campaign, the fewer resources they needed to sustain prolonged sieges. Their entire strategy minimized stagnation. Other armies feared winter campaigns. The Mongols sometimes preferred them. Frozen rivers became highways. Cold weather reduced disease. Supplies increased. Because they were not waiting for supply caravans to catch up, they were already carrying what they needed. This is why traditional military logic failed against them. Generals prepared for familiar patterns. They expected invaders to depend on fixed lines of support, but the Mongols had erased that weakness. Their supply line was not behind them, it was alive. And because it was alive, it could not be cut in the way other armies could be crippled. Mobility fed the Mongol army. But mobility alone does not conquer empires. Speed without direction is chaos. Endurance without strategy is wasted strength. What made the Mongols truly unstoppable was how they combined their self-sustaining system with something even more powerful: intelligence and psychological warfare. Most medieval armies moved like heavy shadows. They announced their presence days before arrival. Scouts were limited. Communication was slow. By the time commanders received information, it was already outdated. The Mongols changed that pattern completely. They did not move blindly into enemy territory. Long before the main force arrived, scouts were already deep inside hostile land. Small reconnaissance units mapped terrain, observed defenses, identified weak points, and reported back rapidly. Their horses made this possible. A scout could ride extraordinary distances in a short time. Messages traveled faster than most governments could react. The Mongol command structure allowed quick decisions without bureaucratic delay. This meant something critical. They often knew more about their enemy than the enemy knew about them. They understood river crossings. They identified supply depots. They calculated defensive weaknesses, and then they struck where resistance was weakest. But they did not always attack directly. Sometimes they pretended to retreat. The feigned retreat became one of their deadliest weapons. Mongol cavalry would charge, clash briefly, then appear to panic and flee. Enemy forces, believing victory was near, would pursue in disorder. Then the trap closed. Fresh Mongol units would flank from hidden positions. Arrows rained from multiple directions. What began as pursuit became slaughter. This tactic required discipline and coordination. It also required confidence. Confidence comes from security. An army that fears starvation cannot afford elaborate deception. It cannot afford to divide forces. It cannot risk temporary separation. The Mongols could, because their survival system gave them independence. Their warriors carried what they needed. Their units could operate apart from the main army without collapsing. This allowed complex maneuvers that other forces avoided. Mobility gave them options. Options gave them unpredictability. And unpredictability created fear. Fear became another weapon. Stories spread ahead of their arrival. Cities heard of massacres in distant lands. Kingdoms received reports of entire armies destroyed in days. Whether every story was exaggerated did not matter. The psychological impact was devastating. Some cities surrendered without resistance. Some rulers fled before battle. Some alliances collapsed out of panic. The Mongols did not simply defeat armies, they attacked morale. When defenders expected a long siege, the Mongols appeared suddenly and violently. When armies believed they were safe behind distance, Mongol cavalry arrived unexpectedly. No safe rhythm existed. Traditional war followed patterns. Campaign seasons were predictable. Supply shortages forced pauses. Winter slowed movement. The Mongols broke those expectations. They moved in winter when rivers froze solid. They crossed deserts others avoided. They split forces and reunited them seamlessly. They did not fight war according to established rules. They redesigned the pace of war itself. And because they were not chained to traditional supply lines, they could maintain this pace longer than anyone expected. Their communication systems strengthened this advantage. Relay riders carried messages across vast territories using fresh horses at regular intervals. Orders moved quickly. Coordination across separated units remained possible. Even after conquering enormous regions, their internal communication remained efficient. This prevented chaos within expansion. Other empires expanded too quickly and fractured. The Mongols built systems that maintained cohesion across distance. Their decentralized structure allowed local autonomy while maintaining loyalty to central authority. It was not random brutality. It was organized efficiency. An army that feeds itself is dangerous. An army that feeds itself, moves faster than intelligence can track, and weaponizes fear, becomes nearly unstoppable. Their enemies kept trying to fight them with familiar solutions. Fortify cities, block roads, burn crops, assemble large armies. But these strategies assumed the Mongols depended on the same vulnerabilities as everyone else. They did not, and because of that, every conventional response weakened against them. By the time many empires understood this difference, it was already too late. By the early 13th century, the Mongols were no longer raiders, they were an expanding storm. What made established empires tremble was not just Mongol brutality. Many civilizations had faced brutal enemies before. What terrified them was something else. The Mongols did not behave like invaders they understood. Take the Khwarezmian Empire. It stretched across Persia and Central Asia. It controlled wealthy cities, trade routes, and fortified strongholds. On paper, it was stronger than the Mongols. Larger population, greater economic base, more infrastructure. It should have survived. Instead, it collapsed with shocking speed. Why? Because its defensive assumptions were built on traditional warfare. Khwarezmian leaders believed distance protected them. They assumed vast deserts would slow any invading force. They trusted city walls and supply depots to sustain long resistance. They miscalculated everything. The Mongols did not crawl across the desert with heavy baggage. They crossed it rapidly. Their cavalry appeared where defenders thought movement was impossible. Cities prepared for prolonged sieges. Instead, they faced sudden imprisonment, and because the Mongols did not rely on long supply chains, they could sustain multi-pronged campaigns simultaneously. They split into separate forces, striking multiple cities at once. This shattered coordination among defenders. Most empires relied on centralized command. When one region was attacked, reinforcements marched from another. But Mongol speed disrupted that rhythm. By the time one army responded, another city had already fallen. This was not just conquest. It was disorientation. Now consider northern China. The Jin dynasty possessed fortified cities, advanced engineering, and vast resources. Their military traditions were sophisticated. Their walls were formidable. But their system assumed the enemy would exhaust itself. Sieges normally drained attackers. Supply lines stretched thin. Disease spread. Morale weakened. The Mongols inverted that logic. They moved relentlessly. When necessary, they adopted siege technologies from conquered engineers. They learned quickly. They adapted without hesitation. Their mobility allowed them to avoid predictable patterns. They attacked weakly defended points. They bypassed strongholds temporarily. They isolated regions methodically. They did not need to conquer everything at once. They only needed to destabilize enough to break resistance. And because they were not dependent on slow logistical chains, they could maintain pressure longer than expected. Even Eastern Europe felt this shock. When Mongol forces entered Russia and later advanced into Hungary and Poland, European leaders struggled to understand what they were facing. Knights charged in heavy armor. The Mongols did not meet them head-on. They circled. They fragmented. They fired volleys of arrows from a distance. They retreated strategically. Then they returned. European armies expected decisive engagements. Instead, they faced fluid warfare. And always, behind it all, was that same structural advantage. The Mongols were not worried about supply depots miles behind them. They were not terrified of being cut off from home territory. They were not anchored to a fragile chain of wagons and roads. Their survival moved with them. This gave them psychological freedom. Freedom to divide forces. Freedom to risk bold maneuvers. Freedom to operate in hostile terrain. Other armies feared isolation. The Mongols weaponized it. Empires built walls to stop invaders. Walls slow armies dependent on siege logistics. They do little against forces that can bypass, regroup, and return unpredictably. The deeper truth is this: the Mongols did not simply conquer territory. They exploited structural weaknesses in settled civilizations. Settled empires were powerful but rigid. Their food systems were centralized. Their economies were fixed in cities. Their armies depended on infrastructure. The Mongols came from a decentralized world. Flexibility defeated rigidity. Mobility defeated stability. And because their logistics were alive rather than mechanical, they could operate where others collapsed. But no system is eternal. Even the Mongols faced limits. Expansion stretched communication. Governing vast populations required different strategies than conquering them. Internal divisions eventually emerged. Yet during their explosive rise, the combination of self-sustaining mobility, intelligence coordination, psychological warfare, and adaptive tactics created something rare in history. An army that did not play by existing rules. When people study the Mongol Empire, they often focus on destruction, burned cities, collapsed kingdoms, terrified populations. But destruction was not the secret. The secret was structure. The Mongols did not conquer the world because they were reckless. They conquered because they removed the greatest weakness in pre-modern warfare: dependency. Every major empire before them relied on fixed systems, fixed agriculture, fixed cities, fixed supply depots, fixed roads. Power looked strong from the outside, but it was fragile underneath. Cut the grain shipments, and the army weakened. Destroy the roads, and reinforcements stalled. Block the rivers, and communication slowed. Most civilizations built strength on infrastructure. The Mongols built strength on mobility. Their supply system did not stretch behind them like a vulnerable thread. It lived, breathed, and moved beside them. Their horses fed from open grasslands. Their warriors carried dried meat and fermented milk. Their economy was not locked inside walls. They turned nomadic survival into military advantage. This changed the mathematics of war. Traditional armies calculated how far they could travel before starving. The Mongols calculated how fast they could strike before resistance formed. Other empires feared distance. The Mongols used distance as a weapon. The deeper lesson is not about horses or fermented milk. It is about independence. When your survival system moves with you, you become unpredictable. When your strength does not depend on fixed routes, you become harder to weaken. When your structure allows decentralization, you gain flexibility. The Mongols mastered all three: mobility, independence, adaptability. This is why their enemies kept fighting the wrong battle. Defenders tried to burn crops. The Mongols did not rely on crops. They tried to block roads. The Mongols did not depend on roads. They tried to trap supply caravans. There were no caravans. Every strategy assumed the Mongols shared the same vulnerabilities as other armies. They did not. And because of that misunderstanding, empires fell one after another. But there is something even more important. The Mongols were not invincible because they had no supply lines. They were invincible because they redesigned logistics entirely. Modern militaries still study this principle, not because they plan to drink horseblood, but because the concept of mobility-based sustainment remains powerful. Airborne units, rapid deployment forces, modular supply systems all reflect one central idea: reduce dependency, increase flexibility. The Mongols understood this centuries before industrial warfare. They proved that an army tied too tightly to infrastructure becomes predictable, and predictability creates weakness. For a brief period in history, the Mongol Empire expanded faster than any land empire before or after. From the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Europe, their cavalry reshaped continents, not because they ignored logistics, but because they mastered it differently. Their supply line did not stretch across miles of fragile roads. It rode beneath them. And once that system was unleashed, traditional empires could not adapt quickly enough to survive. The Mongols did not simply conquer territory. They exposed the hidden vulnerabilities of settled power, and in doing so they changed the logic of war forever.